Hello, welcome back. I'm your host, Hayden, licensed mental health therapist, Cancer Moon, first to get deep at any party, and this is the Evergreen RX. All right, so today's mini dose is going to be a good one. If you're not familiar, mini doses are where I answer listener questions, talk about trends, give my opinion, and kind of just keep the conversation going with you guys. I'm really loving the mini doses. I feel like it's a good way for us to kind of casually talk about what's going on in the world. If you guys have any questions, you can send them in, and then maybe you'll hear them in a mini dose. And it feels like we're kind of talking back and forth about what's going on in our lives and maybe some of the blocks or things that we're curious about that we bump up against as we, pursue our wellness journey, creating this prescription for living well, doing things to better our lives, to know ourselves better, and to live more intentionally. So today we have a question from the internet. Somebody says, I stopped using social media. What now? Basically, I finally won the battle against social media, but I find myself just substituting the dopamine with Netflix and other stuff when I could be spending time on my goals or reading. Is there anything I can do now to actually stick with it? Okay, so my response to this question is going to be kind of multi-part. One, I want to address dopamine because they mentioned it in this question, and I feel like that does have a big impact to adding a little bit of context to what's going on when we're trying to change or create healthier habits with social media. But then I also want to talk about this phenomenon of trying to drop unhealthy habits, but then finding that we just substitute them, we find something else, they get replaced, and we're kind of back on the hamster wheel, and to talk a little bit about like where that comes from and how to maybe address it. And then a little bit I'm going to talk on, just really getting curious with what we deem to be better habits or more preferred activities, and also breaking down some of the expectation that we might have wrapped up in all of this of needing to be consistent every single day, day in, day out, month after month, and kind of being confused or thrown off when our behavior seems to fluctuate for no apparent reason, and how to kind of deal with that. And I've got some book recommendations for you guys at the end if anybody's curious to know more on how to disconnect from your phone, to learn more about dopamine, and just in general how we use our time and our relationship to our time and the hobbies that we spend our time on. So I think it's gonna be a good one, short, sweet, let's get in, get out. But yeah, first I want to talk about dopamine because I think this is so important in context with why we might struggle with our relationship to phones and social media, things like that. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter. We have a lot of other neurotransmitters, things like cortisol, serotonin, but dopamine in particular is kind of the one we think of making us feel good, feeling like there's this reward after activities. It's kind of like the brain's reward system. And if you want to know more about this, I'm sure there's plenty of other podcasts you can search up. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not going to really do a deep dive, but basically, whenever we do an activity, you can think of like the runner's high, or when you get in the flow state, the brain can kind of hit the dopamine button and we get this wash of good feelings. And it can be really reinforcing. When we know an activity creates dopamine for us, typically we want to return to that activity and we want to avoid the ones that create cortisol, which is stress. So, social media in particular is a hijack system on our dopamine. A lot of you guys might have watched The Social Dilemma, that documentary that came out a couple years ago, talking about the industry of social media and how it kind of preys on us and how these apps are created to just keep us hooked. I mean, it's like slot machines at a casino. Lights, colors, sounds, it's fast, it's always engaging activity. The algorithm now curates exactly what you want to see or what it thinks you want to see. to keep you hooked. Because when you're on their app, they're making more money. And so there's a lot of vested interest in people creating these apps to make it really hard to disengage. So I want to just add that to throw in some compassion off the bat. If you are struggling with this, you're not alone. It's not just you either. It's not a, faulty willpower. It really is a vested interest in certain people or groups to keep you hooked, to make it really hard to quit, or make it really hard to have healthy boundaries and a healthy relationship with social media. So now that that's out of the way, we've got a little context. You're probably still sitting there and you want to, know how to work with this relationship that we have with social media that seems like it's probably never going to go away. So whether you want to create healthier boundaries or you want to quit cold turkey, I think the first thing we can consider is, how is social media serving you? Why do you use it? What are you using it for? Are you doom scrolling? Are you looking at certain people's pages? Maybe old friends that you miss, or celebrities that you admire, or maybe you even kind of envy them and you are engaging in a certain way. You can really start to notice what your behavior is. For me, I try to use social media primarily for work. For this podcast, I try to stay on there and stay engaged with people who I really like what they're doing and I think they're making good content. But I'm a human and I search up people's profiles sometimes that I probably shouldn't. I'm doing these deep dives on people in my life or maybe that used to be in my life, that I'm curious what's going on with them, and it leaves me feeling really bad. Which off the jump, it'd be like, well, then why the fuck do I do that? But it is serving me in some way. And whatever you're doing on social media, it's serving you in some way, or else you wouldn't be doing it. Whether that's just a distraction, or a way to have material and fodder to compare yourself to others, that's going to be different on a case-by-case basis. But to really sit down and get curious about it can be the first kind of like cue into if we are trying to replace this behavior with something else and it seems like it's just causing the same problems. Like in this person's question, maybe they're just replacing it with Netflix and they're like, this is not what I want to do. I want to do other things with my time. It can be a cue into like, okay, how is Netflix maybe serving the same purpose that social media was serving for you? An easy thought would be, well, it's a good distraction. Okay, well, what are you distracting from? Things like what we might desire to do, like reading or playing the piano or knitting, going out with friends, those might generate some more uncomfortable feelings than social media does, or Netflix does, or, obsessively reading the news does. That might push us a little bit to use our mental capacity a little more, to go out of our comfort zone. Maybe it creates a little bit of anxiety trying something new that you're not particularly good at. Maybe you feel a little more bored because it's not as engaging as something like TikTok. So starting to kind of recognize, analyze your own particular relationship, and then understanding when we take away one coping mechanism and we don't have another one, a healthier one in place, or we have not done the healing to not need that coping mechanism anymore, we're just going to replace it with something else. For sure. Like if I was using social media 2 hours a day and I stopped tomorrow, am I all of a sudden going to be some cottage woman that's spending my time embroidering and making bread and chatting with my friends for hours on end, and just my life transforms because I cut out this kind of what I see as this malignant, bad behavior? Probably not. Probably not. Why? Because of what I'm saying. Those uncomfortable emotions that social media might be helping you avoid, they're still going to be there. They're still going to be waiting. And so that is the area where we bring in the curiosity and we bring in the compassion to be like, okay, am I avoiding something here? Boredom, for example, that can just be a practice of getting good at getting bored and feeling okay with it. If you sit at the doctor's office and you try not to pull out your phone, maybe the first time you do that, wildly uncomfortable. Second time, maybe a little less. Third time, maybe you start noticing things you didn't notice before. It is just this like repeated practice, the same way we got, kind of conditioned into opening that app over and over again. We have to condition ourselves into something else, or ideally, many other things, multiple other things. So we don't just have one that we keep turning to, we have an array of activities. Another part of this is starting to keep some tabs on the fluctuations in your energy level, in your level of focus, in your motivation throughout the month. So for any women listening, anybody that menstruates, starting to track your cycle can be really helpful. I know for myself, there are certain parts of my cycle where my focus is like out the window. I'm like, where did all of my motivation and drive from last week go? And it is just out the window. And I find myself turning to my vices a little bit more. Maybe I am scrolling on social media more at that time. So starting to track it to be able to tailor your kind of toolbox or your habits to that time in your life. And this doesn't just apply to menstrual cycles. This can be a lot of things, what season it is, what the weather is like where you are, what your stress level is like at certain times. Students, maybe during finals or into semester times, you find yourself kind of leaning on some of these old habits a little bit more. So there's a lot of things that can cause these fluctuations, but I know for myself, there are times where it's a lot easier to disengage than others. And it does not help when I berate myself over why it's easier at sometimes versus others. Because we are just like fluctuating human beings. Things do change over time and they morph and they look different in a season of your life versus another one. It's just always changing and adapting. And I think sometimes where social media really gets us hooked in is it overrides all of that. Time, place, season, whatever it is, it will override and just numb out everything else. So when we start to detach from that, sometimes we have that tendency to still want to look for like a one size fits all behavior or hobby that we can replace it with that feels better. I know this person said reading, and I'm going to touch more on that in just a second. But unfortunately, that's just not how life really works outside of these super dopamine hijacking behaviors. We are a lot more nuanced. We require a lot more diversity in normal day-to-day life when we're not just numbing and blunting out all of the emotional range that might be happening under the surface. When we're really in alignment and in connection with our body, with our emotions, it's like a baby. Like it requires a lot more flexibility and adaptability than when we're numb. You're always having to work with a baby to figure out how to respond and what they need in that moment. And we are no different. The only reason it feels different or we get fooled into thinking it's different is because social media just numbs everything out. And then you can't have a one size fits all approach. And it will kind of leave you feeling bad a lot of the time. But at least for the time being, you felt a little bit better. And then you feel a little bit bad. And guess what's there? Your Instagram app is still there waiting for you to open it up again and hit ignore on the time limit that you set for it. That's why. This is what's happening. We are expecting more long-term healthy or enjoyable hobbies to have the same kind of short burst, intense dopamine effect, and it just won't. I know. It sucks. It sucks because we're so used to having things that just slam on that dopamine button and it feels so good for a second. And we want life to feel that way all the time. And it can't. So the last thing I want to touch on is the thing about reading that this person asked, why can't I spend more time on my goals or on reading? And just so you know, you can stay tuned. I have a mini dose coming talking about goals and our relationship to goals. So I'm going to touch on that more. But I also like to question, why do we think of certain hobbies as better than others? There's, really common saying, everything in moderation, including moderation. And I think that goes the same for social media. I do think it can have a role in our lives, clearly, because I'm engaged in it. I've had to tell myself that it has a role in our lives and it can be used in a way that is beneficial, is fun. We can make certain connections. We can learn a lot from it. There are good things that can come from it if we're able to use it in moderation. And I feel this with all hobbies. This person wants to read more. Okay, that's great. But if you just turn to reading obsessively and at an addictive level, you've just replaced what social media was doing. Anything can be addictive. We can do anything to a unhealthy amount. And I mean unhealthy as a distraction from whatever we don't want to face in our life, whatever emotion or situation we don't want to deal with. Reading can be used as that tool too. I'm sure people in the 1800s had things that they like to do that helped them not, deal with their emotions. Most people were probably working too long hours to even have the capacity to deal with their emotions, but some of the wealthier people, you could probably knit to an unhealthy amount, I'm sure. So, bringing that in to kind of question some of these value judgments that we make on certain hobbies over others. If you feel like you have a pretty healthy relationship with social media, then you don't have to disengage from it. You don't have to quit. You can learn to use these things in moderation, and not villainize or judge yourself versus others that you think might have, healthier or cooler, better hobbies than you do, or spend their time in better ways. Hopefully this gave you some stuff to chew on. I want to just say, I still struggle with this a lot myself. So this is fully just my thoughts, kind of where I'm at on this journey. And so I want to hear from you. Where are you at? What has helped you? Let me know your questions, your thoughts. Like I said, some books that I will have linked that I think are really good reads if you're wanting to dive more into this. One is a book called Dopamine Nation. I personally have not read this one yet, but have on good authority. It's a really good read if you want to know more about the dopamine system, more about how it's being hijacked, and how to kind of reset your relationship with the dopamine receptors in your brain. Another good book is How to Break Up with Your Phone. I mentioned this in episode 3 on microdosing mindfulness. So if you want to hear a little bit more about how to, kind of increase mindfulness and presence, that's a good episode to listen to. And How to Break Up with Your Phone is a really good book to read to kind of jumpstart creating new boundaries, new relationship with your phone. It can be a really helpful supplement to some of this more mental, emotional exploration that I've laid out in this episode. And then another one is 4,000 Weeks. I absolutely love this book. It's more for those productivity junkies that are always interested in optimizing and spending their time and working towards their goal, and just really analyzing our relationship to time and to productivity, which I think can really be wrapped up a lot in this desire to quit some of our bad habits so that then we can ideally have more time to achieve more goals and work. And so that one just came up for me in preparing for this episode. And I thought, if anybody's interested, it's a good resource. So yeah, there's some stuff for you guys. Follow along if you want to hear more. I'm on TikTok, I'm on Instagram at the Evergreen RX. You can reach out to me on any of those platforms with questions, with your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. Yeah, follow along for more on all things mental health, holistic health, living intentional, talking about spirituality, getting a little witchy. We've got it all. I'd love for you to join. And until next time, see ya.